What dark secret lies within the upscale neighborhood where a young woman named Emily was found dead, and is it connected to the mysterious doctor who once lived there and met a gruesome end? Are you ready to delve into the darkest corners of the unknown? Subscribe now for a chilling journey. I used to be a police officer in a city in Virginia. There is one upscale neighborhood in our city with very nice homes. I was always told stories when I was a new officer that there was a doctor who used to live in one of those homes. The story goes that the doctor attempted to perform some type of operation on himself. He numbed his stomach area to make an incision on himself, but since he couldn't feel it, he accidentally cut too far into deep and accidentally disemboweled himself. When officers and paramedics arrived, he was found barely alive, holding his own intestines, and ultimately died. Fast forward, I was assigned to call about a young female who was found dead by her older sister. When I arrive on scene, it is in the aforementioned nice neighborhood. When I exited my vehicle, I immediately had an uneasy feeling about the house. Well, on the outside it just had bad energy surrounding it. I suppose as I approached the front porch, I noticed countless empty energy drink cans and a Ouija board on the front patio table. Everything about this house just felt off and wrong. But when I was inside, the family was obviously very distraught. I was told that the deceased sister, her name was Emily, was in the basement at this point. Another officer had arrived too, and so he stayed upstairs with the family. As I entered the basement was unfinished and was fairly dark, minus 2 pool string light bulbs, one on each side of the basement. The scene in the basement was similar to the front porch, though energy drink cans were everywhere, and another Ouija board was on a small coffee table. Emily, who was 19 if I remember correctly, was hanging by her neck on a basement rafter. She had unfortunately ended her own life with an exercise band and was swinging back and forth slightly. It was a horrible sight, and another officer helped me lift her to bring her down. Emily's family consisted of her mother and father and her oldest sister. Her parents stated that they had been trying to help her because all she ever did was drink energy drinks to stay up all hours of the night playing on the Ouija board. Her sister gave a little bit more detail about it being sister. She stated that they were very close and told each other everything pretty much. Her older sister said that Emily indeed had been obsessed with the Ouija board, drinking energy drinks to stay up all night, and talk to what she believed was her boyfriend who was dead. Her sister stated that Emily had been saying that her boyfriend was begging for her to come join him in the afterlife, and so she believed that this is why she did what she did. Now, let me reiterate, this house felt wrong. Everything felt bad, and I had a very uneasy and sick feeling, being in that basement, and not because of the dead body. After all, it definitely wasn't my first. This is a call that really messed me for a while, though, and we really never got much more explanation, and as cops, you kind of just have to move on to the next call. But 2 weeks later to the day, I get a call about a car accident with ejection. I head to the call C1 lights and sirens and arrive to find a convertible BMW with the top down, which had experienced an obvious horrible crash and rollover. I was sitting on its wheels, and in the driver's seat was a woman who clearly had a broken neck, as her head was almost all the way turned around. Next to the vehicle, about 25 feet away, though, was a man who had been ejected. Keep in mind, this was a convertible, so he was ejected from the top of the car, and let's just say that, but it was a horrible scene. I went to close off the scene with some yellow tape. I walked about 75 yards away from the accident, where I found yet another chunk of the guy. I'm not trying to be intentionally graphic here, but I want to paint the picture of just how bad and violent this car accident was. Upon obtaining the man's ID, I read the information off to the dispatch, and then another officer, and I both realized the same thing at the same time. These two people. They were Emily's parents, who, 2 weeks to the day, just died in a horrible way, and I tell you that breaking the news to the older sister was absolutely heartbreaking. In fact, I kept in touch with her for a little while. After this, she had inherited her parents' estate and all of the life insurance money, etc. She ended up selling off everything and buying a different house to try and start over and repair her broken life. However, it doesn't end here, because around a month later another officer was called after a pedestrian was struck by a car while she was jogging in her neighborhood, and yes, you guessed it was the sister. She managed to survive several weeks in a coma, but ultimately she just didn't make it. If you're wondering why the story about the doctor is relevant, it's because the house that Emily killed herself in was the same house that the doctor lived in. I don't know what you guys think, but to me it definitely seems like either that house is cursed or Emily opened up something really bad. That was all a few years ago now, and I'm no longer a police officer. I moved a couple of states away, and twice now I found 2 different Ouija board planets on the sidewalk when going to check my mail. I never touch them, obviously, and usually use a stick or something to push them into the storm drain. But coincidence? I'm not so sure. I grew up in a fairly rural area of Virginia. As a kid, I had an obsession for dirt bikes. Watching Motocross on TV, the X Games, reading Racerx magazines, it was all I thought about. So when my mom and dad bought me my first dirt bike one Christmas, I was ecstatic from that moment too. My days were consumed with riding that thing. As soon as I got home from school until sundown, pretty much you could bet that I was in those woods somewhere riding around. Right behind my parents' house was a huge expanse of woods. There was a trail that ran virtually the entire length of our neighborhood. It was a point-to-point trail with a few turns, hills and jumps. It would take about 15 minutes on my dirt bike to ride the length of the trail from end to end. There were no other trails too, just this one long trail, and when I got to the end, I would just turn around and go back the other way. I would ride back and forth for hours, pretty much every day. I ended up learning that trail like the back of my hand, where every tree root was, where every turn was, where every rut was. I mean, you get the picture now. When I was 13, I started having this reoccurring dream. I would be riding my dirt bike along that familiar trail, when suddenly there would be a new intersection, a brand new trail to go down. I would ride down it and come to a large clearing in the woods. In my dream, I had this feeling that when I got to the clearing, I was supposed to be looking for something, finding something there, but every time I got to the clearing, I would always wake up. This reoccurring dream continued as well until I was about 14. I left my house one afternoon, hopped on my dirt bike like normal, and began another afternoon of riding back and forth on the trail. I rode for around an hour. When it happened, I was heading up a small hill mindlessly by this point, knowing everything to expect coming over the hill, though I saw it there all of a sudden was the intersection. I locked my rear brakes, causing the rear end to slide sideways slightly. I couldn't believe my eyes. Was this real? I sat there for several minutes, my bike's motor idling, staring down the trail. 1,000 thoughts suddenly raced through my head. I mean, how is this possible? Was it always here looking down the trail? I couldn't see the end of looking down the trail. I couldn't see the end of it. Went straight for about 50 yards, but I couldn't make out what was at the end, and it was as if I couldn't focus on it clear enough. It was just sort of a straight trail, though I guess it matched exactly what was in my dream though, and so in the end I decided not to go down it, almost not believing that it was really there. I told myself that if it was there again tomorrow, then I would go down it anyway. The next day came and I again ventured out into the woods. I rode straight to the spot where I saw the new trail, fully expecting for it to be gone, but sure enough there it was again. I made the turn at the intersection, and that's when I slowly began riding down the trail. I drove down the trail, staying in third gear, slow and steady. The trail was completely straight, and it only took me about a minute to reach it. The clearing, that is the exact clearing that I always saw in my dreams. Dumbfounded, I sort of stopped, put my kickstand down, turned off the motor and got off my bike. I took off my helmet, looking around. What the heck, I whispered to myself. The clearing itself was a perfect circle, around 50 feet in diameter. It was surrounded by dense forest minus the single trail leading to it. Obviously I couldn't make sense of this, though I thought that I was losing my mind or something. I walked around the circle confused, contemplating what it all meant, and looking around for answers. I began to feel an eerie feeling, though all of a sudden, as if I was being watched, a feeling of dread and danger suddenly crept up the back of my neck. I felt as if I was suddenly somewhere that I was very much not supposed to be. Man, to heck with this. I said. I threw my helmet back on, not bothering to buckle it, and I kick-started my dirt bike, bringing life back to the motor. I peeled back down the trail, shifting gears, and I hauled me back home. I rode for a few minutes when it suddenly hit me, though. Why the heck is it taking so long to get back? I mean, it took less than a minute to reach the clearing. Yet I've been riding down this trail for what felt like was several minutes, and I hadn't met back up with my familiar trail. Yet at that I started to panic, getting disoriented. I told myself maybe I'm just going the wrong way. I knew that it didn't make sense, but I was willing to try anything to get out of there. At that moment I spun the bike back around, and within about 10 seconds I made it back to the clearing. All of a sudden I peeled around again back down the trail. Again I rode and rode, never making it back to the intersection, though I stopped, got off my bike feeling defeated, confused and a little bit scared. Now I threw my helmet, and collapsed next to a tree. Sobbing on my knees, I let out a frustrated and terrified scream. I guess I sat there trying to think of what to do next. I'm not sure how long I sat there for, but it felt like hours. I could see the sun dropping in the sky, the woods getting dimmer. I started to feel like I was never going home, so I closed my eyes and somehow, probably out of mental exhaustion, I must have fallen asleep with my back against a tree. I'm really not sure how long I slept for, but I woke up immediately, jumped to my feet, wildly looking around and quickly gathering my bearings. And it was then that I realized that the sun was shining brightly, and I was now back on the trail. My trio, my blessed familiar trio, the intersection and the new trio were still there, but somehow I was out quickly. I jumped onto my bike, riding as fast as I could to get home. I had no idea how long I was gone for and thought that my parents were probably worried. Sick exiting the woods by my house. I parked my bike and I quickly ran inside. "Hi, honey," my mom said. "I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. I just lost track of time. I managed to get out." "Well, it's only been an hour. I'm surprised you're already back inside." "Actually," my mom said. I stood there mth agape staring at my mom. "Are you okay, sweetie?" My mother asked me and a look of concern was suddenly growing on her face. I forced out an awkward smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm just not feeling well." I think I went to my room and a million questions were running through my mind. I spent the next few days confused, replaying every moment through my head. I wanted to just make sense of everything, to have some logical reason for it all, but there just wasn't any in the end. I devised a plan, though that looking back was honestly incredibly stupid, but I couldn't live with not knowing what the heck happened to me in those woods that day. Now my dad was a bit of a tool. Connors, sir, any tool hardware, rope, bungee cords. I mean, he was your guy, and among his collection, he had a giant spool of yellow rope, around 600 feet of it. I decided that I was going to use that rope, tie it to a tree at the intersection, and then ride back down the trail to investigate the rope. It would serve as my lifeline, helping guide me back when I was ready to leave, and that day I went back out getting to the trail intersection. I tied one end of the rope around my waist and used several bungee cords to tie the spool to a tree, giving me slack, but staying secure, to the tree, and afterward I headed back down the trail feeling a new boost of confidence and determination. I rode back down that trail and quickly arrived back to the clearing. I kept one hand on the knot on my waist, being sure that it stayed there. I got off my bike, leaving it idling, and walked into the middle of the circle. I started to get that eerie feeling again, as if I was being watched, but this time I shook it off. A new feeling of bravery had suddenly come over me. I felt determined to discover what it was that we were supposed to find here, and what the point of all this was. I forced down the feeling of dread. Scanning the clearing, I suddenly became fixated on one tree in particular. This tree was darker than the rest, almost looking burned. Maybe I go closer to it. Flaky black scorch marks covered the tree. I was staring at the tree, almost feeling stuck in place, when suddenly something began slowly peeking its head out from behind it. The face was black, burned, decayed and not human, almost like a bad imitation of one. It had short wiry black hair that looked oily and covered in soot, and as soon as its eyes met mine, my dirt bike's motor shut off. All of a sudden the silence caused me to turn around to look at my bike. Then I quickly turned back, but when I did the thing was gone eerily, though the woods suddenly became very silent for a split second. I froze too, until instinct in my body kicked in and told me to get the heck out of there quickly. I sprinted back to my bike. It kick-started it harder than I ever had. I half expected it to not start, but to my relief it had started. I left my helmet behind, riding as fast as I could. The image of the thing's eyes burned into my mind in my haste to leave. I made a fatal mistake, though having walked a good ways past my bike into the clearing, I had created way too much slack in the rope. When heading back the opposite direction, I was shifting gears, going faster and faster, when suddenly the rope caught my chain, my rear wheel locked and I was sent straight over the handlebars, although in pain. I got to my feet as quickly as I could, dirty, limping, a burning pain in my ribs. The rope was still tied around my waist, but it had somehow been severed in the crash. Frantically, I looked around for the rest of the rope, the end that would lead me back, but it was just gone. I ran to my bike in any case and trying desperately to get the pieces of the rope out of my chain and sprocket. When I saw it movement from the corner of my eye, I stopped, froze, looking in the direction of the movement. I then saw more movement again out of the corner of my eye. It was as if it was, I don't know, anticipating my moves, staying just out of eyesight, darting between the trees. Almost I took off, running down the trail, abandoned my bike. My adrenaline was pumping and I knew that I was running for my life. I then spotted the yellow rope, that beautiful yellow rope. I literally screamed yes, running it quickly as I could toward it, following it to salvation. But the rope, it began retracting, dragging on the ground back up the trail. No, I screamed, running as fast as I could toward it. I ran after it, as it seemed to run away from me. I was hoping to see the intersection, praying that it would be there, and then all of a sudden I did. I reached the intersection, crying, heaving, trying and failing to catch my breath for a second. I felt pure relief for making it out alive, but that was when I noticed something. The yellow rope, the spool, was no longer bungee to the tree. The rope now led behind the tree. Slowly it stepped out from behind the tree, revealing itself in its entirety. It was the thing from the clearing. The woods suddenly fell silent. Again. A feeling of pure dread came over me. It had a look of pure malice in its gaze and a terrible smile, as it continued to gather up the rest of the yellow rope. I was frozen in fear. I felt as if I was in ice water. I couldn't catch my breath, couldn't scream. I just stood there frozen. I can only describe what I saw as a distorted imitation of a human black chard. Its form twisted and contorted into a grotesque mockery of life. Its eyes were pools of endless darkness, devoid of empathy or humanity, gleaming with an ancient predatory intelligence. It then began to move toward me slowly. Weirdly, though, its steps were completely silent, and the air around me suddenly grew cold and carried a stench of like decay or something. With each movement, its body sort of shifted and rippled too, as if it was sort of struggling to contain its own shape. Its presence filled me with an overwhelming dread, a primal fear that seized my entire being. Its voice was terrible too, a twisted mixture of a whisper and a scream. Almost I felt as if its gaze seeped into my mind, into my very being, turning my thoughts into twisted and nightmarish desires. And as it approached closer and stood over me, I honestly thought that I was about to die. And then suddenly everything just went black. I woke up back on my familiar trail, the intersection now gone, the rope now gone. No trace of anything was left. I was in shock and in pain, and I walked back home. In the end I told my parents that I crashed my dirt bike and wasn't strong enough to push it back home. My dad went back into the woods to look for it, but he never could find it. Honestly, I didn't care. I was never going to touch another dirt bike for the rest of my life as far as I was concerned, and since then, though, everything has felt different. I feel like something is missing in me, as if that thing took something from me. I know that's weird, but I felt unable to enjoy anything, unable to have relationships, unable to care. I struggle to sleep. I don't even really feel tired. I just couldn't really feel anything anymore. I didn't know what to do. I just felt like a shell that Christmas, though, my family and I were getting ready to leave for a Christmas tree farm, an annual tradition. That used to bring me excitement. My parents were trying their best and they saw the change in me. Everyone did putting on brave faces. My parents asked me if I was excited to pick out a tree. I wasn't excited, not at all. I couldn't be excited about anything anymore. Sure, I said, trying my best sound convincing. Before we left, though, my dad was digging in the garage looking for something. Hey bud, have you seen my yellow rope? The question sent me into a flashback of full terror, leaving me screaming, sobbing and begging for help, begging for it to stop. From then on, I spent years in and out of therapy and even institutions. I am an adult now, but I've just never shaken the feel of pure emptiness. I decided that I'm going to go back to my childhood home, back to that familiar trail that I can still remember like the back of my hand. If the intersection is there, then I'm going to go back down it. In fact, I've decided that I'm going to try to kill that thing and get back the piece of myself that it clearly took. Well, if it kills me taking the rest of me, well, so be it either way. I don't want to live like this anymore, and I'm going to be free of this. I grew up in a century house. I think it was 105 years old in 1985, so very old it was beautiful, but I hated the vibes there always felt nasty and sort of unclean. Between the ages of 3 and 8, though, I would see a fuzzy misty sort of apparition that would play peekaboo with me in the mornings as I lay in bed at first. It would be misty and become intermittently more solid, waxing and waning in its visibility like power surges for a long time. I would stare, especially on weekends when I slept in and had time to ponder, thinking that I was half asleep, but I would count spell words, do my ABCs later, recite prime numbers, pinch myself, move about to make sure that I was awake, and I can assure you that I always was. I'm a pretty straightforward person. Always have been, but I couldn't believe my eyes. But then I got used to it, and it would just keep playing peekaboo, as I read my books and magazines went. I got some cereal, sometimes take a bath and came back and read later. When I got a TV, I would watch cartoons and it would be there. It sort of became my morning ghost buddy. I guess I did my thing and it did its thing. It was a misty shape of a head and shoulder and featureless, but semi-solid. I could see through it, but also it was like staticky and would sometimes be more obvious and then sort of fade back to a less solid fog. Also it sort of looked like moving particles if you stared long enough, like static from TV, but more white. It didn't feel scary, I guess, but just odd to me. It was almost like I was witnessing something highly unusual, and it was sort of bemusing, a phenomena of sorts, I guess. Anyway, the freakiest part is that it was doing the little peek thing at the top corner of the 10-foot door frame. Sometimes a little more than the head and shoulders would move out, and it would be an amorphous blob. But it's like there was a barrier, and it couldn't move far beyond the door frame. I don't even know if it was actually truly conscious enough to be playing with me, or it was sort of stuck there at the frame and doing its thing. But I sort of felt like it had some intention. Just a feeling I had, but that's what it was. Eventually it would stop, or the light got so bright that it would not be discernible. But I think it stopped about mid-morning. I never saw it at night or dusk or any time during the day if I took a nap. This was only in the morning hours between dawn and say 10 or 11:00 a.m. Eventually I just stopped seeing it too. Could be because I started closing my bedroom door at night as I got older and wanted privacy. But I'm not so sure looking at the history of the house that was built by a distant relative who owned a sawmill and local hotel. He was a bad actor. From what I understand, at some point there was a fire shortly after the house was first erected in the 1880s, and the stairwell and the upper floor were damaged and reconstructed. Not a devastating fire that killed anyone, but the stairwell in the foyer on the second floor by my bedroom was not the original, but 20 years or so younger. Maybe that guy, though maybe he killed somebody there because he was a southern gangster of sorts, and was involved in getting rid of some folks, or so it said. Some people did pass away at the house of old age, and natural causes wakes were held there. So maybe a ghost. Appalachia is old, with history predating the settlers. So who knows, to my knowledge no dramatic deaths, and my family are all about knowing the scoop and the family drama, so we could never find anything there. Also, the house eventually burned down due to electrical issues during renovations after we sold it in the 90s. But it had a majorly creepy vibe in some of the rooms, also like a feeling of dread and sort of sadness. I think I had a playroom in the attic and sometimes I would be playing in there and feel like I was being watched and the hair of my arms would actually stand up like fear or static in the air, and my ears would start to ring too. I describe it a bit like the air changed, like when you go to higher altitudes and your ears pop, or when the silence becomes audible. A shift in silence from normal silence to sort of complete and thick silence. It was a total atmospheric shift, a pressure change. I would be so afraid that I would almost get a freeze response, but I somehow knew not to react like that, like I was scared, but to put my things away per usual and calmly leave like normal without freaking out or getting hurried. As I got older, I have heard some bad energies feed on fear. So it's interesting, as a kid, that I knew in my gut not to react like that. Just sort of remove myself, but don't overreact. I've always had a good poker face, and maybe that's why I don't know. But I also don't scare easily, even in situations that would warrant panic. I'll freak out later, but in the moment I just try to stay cool, like autopilot or going numb, which is good in times when you need your wits. That's the first time that I remember engaging in that mode, about 5 or 6 years old in my attic playroom. Another story too is that we lived in a mountainous area, full hills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. At the base of the mountain there was a huge cotton field. It was pretty beautiful actually, but I would freak out when I saw it. My mom said that it started as a toddler, but I would look at the field as we drove by and I would start hyperventilating, whimpering and get tearful. Later, when I got older around 5 and learned what was up, I would just hide under a blanket until we passed it to manage my exposure. As I got even older, I would just look at it and try to figure out what about it vexed me. It was a stunning visage, beautiful and picturesque. Nothing that I know of happened there, like a battle or recent bad history or anything, but my mind saw something. My eye could not, and it was freaky, and for whatever reason I hated it. As an adult, I no longer get that feeling at all when I see the field just a peaceful place. I guess people even take pictures in the late summer and fall and the cotton blooms there. Also there's sunflower fields adjacent to it, and that's pretty glorious. It's a sunny patch in the middle of the mountains, a valley with meadows, and coming off of the mountain you get a bird's eye view, and it's honestly like no other. But as a kid, for whatever reason, I wanted to walk a wide circle around it, and I mean a very wide circle. My grandfather's family had lived in the mountains of very rural central Pennsylvania since the 1700s. In the 1890s, my great-grandfather built an expansion onto a house or loft that his father, born in 1829, had built. The house still stands today, and we still go there most weekends in the summer, as it's 8 miles from a very large and beautiful lake. I've been going there since I was a kid, and we called it the old house. The house is filled with very old photos. Some of the photos we know the ancestors in them, some we actually don't. Some of the photos, though, are very creepy. When I was a child, probably about 9 or 10 years old, we went for a weekend in the summer. I had one pair of sandals that I was wearing, and I would always take them off next to the fireplace, which didn't work anymore. On the morning that we had to leave to go back home, the sandals that I was wearing were now gone. They weren't next to the fireplace anymore. Both my parents and my grandfather, who was there, searched the entire house high and low for my sandals, but they could never find them. Keep in mind that this house is not very large. They searched for hours too before they finally gave up, and I made the 2-hour ride back home, without my shoes. My grandfather stayed at the house for another day before going back home. When my grandfather woke up the next day, the sandals, they were right there, next to the fireplace where I had left them. My family still talks about this to this day. My grandfather told my mom that they must have not wanted her to leave. I've always loved this house and have felt very close to my ancestors. Well in it, but that was pretty creepy. Anyway, I went to the house last summer with my daughter and my friend. I set a vape pen down on the kitchen table. My daughter and friend were outside picking apples off of an apple tree behind the house. We were due to leave the house that morning. I went outside to load up my car, and when I came back in, the vape pen was not on the kitchen table. Nobody else had been in the house between the time that I had set the pen on the table and the time that I had come back in. We searched the entire house and there was just no vape pen to be found. I and my family members have been back at that house half a dozen times since last fall, when this happened, and no vape pen was ever found or recovered. My ancestors never drank or smoked from what my grandfather tells us. My mom tells me all the time that it was them telling you to stop. Not super scary or anything, but it is definitely completely unexplainable. I have always felt a crazy deep connection to that house too, and have taken it upon myself to research and gather a lot of information about my ancestors, who lived on that land. I am the oldest grandchild, and one day that house will become mine, as we always pass it down to the oldest member of the family per my great-grandfather's will. Weirdly enough too, I seem to be the only person whose belongings always go missing in that house. So I live in Pennsylvania, just outside of Philly, and the following happened a few years ago. It was a late November evening and my wife and I were craving wings that day. A quick search brought up a new joint in Royersford, Pennsylvania that had just opened. I put in an online order and then I zip on by. The man behind the counter, middle-aged African-American gentleman with a jovial disposition and a hearty laugh. We talked about the Eagles while he got my food ready. Eventually I thanked him and I left. A few months later he is in the news, apparently for killing his business partner, apparently over a money dispute. She had funds and he wanted them for a new location, but she allegedly refused. He buried her outside of an industrial area and parked her car elsewhere. The police found evidence of him being in her car. Several failed attempts to get access to her Cash App or Venmo account, evidence of a struggle in her home, and before long Chicken Wing Guy was actually arrested, tried and convicted of his business partner's murder. I didn't connect it immediately too, until later, that this was the same guy who had served me after an article named the business that he owned. It was the very restaurant that I got wings at a few months prior. The wings, they weren't good at all, as I recall too, but he was a convicted murderer, and I was served by him. My grandma's property is settled all the way in the back of the woods at the end of a long unpaved road. along with being comically bumpy. It also has a history of hauntings that were passed between family members over the years. I myself was somewhat skeptical of these tales, not because I'm not a believer of the paranormal, but because my uncle and father have a habit of being very exaggerative until one night about a year ago. Back then, I lived with my grandma down at the end of that road, and at the time I also didn't own a car. As such, my boyfriend had to walk to my house from the entrance of the road, since his parents didn't want to risk damaging their vehicles on the aforementioned bumpy road. Mind you, this road is a good 20 minutes walk from the beginning to the end, completely overgrown with bushes and trees, and has a puddle every other step. So more often than not, I'd meet him about halfway, and then walk him back to the entrance. Once he went home that night. When we were walking back to the entrance, I decided to tell him about the property's haunted history from the silver buried on four corners of the property. To appease a supposed dear spirit to the knocking on the counters at night, I spilled every tale that I'd ever heard. Now, unlike me, he was genuinely afraid of such tales, as he himself had once had an experience very similar, albeit much more terrifying, to the one that I was about to have. He warned me not to do one thing. Don't whistle at night. Now a thing to know about me. I'm a habitual whistler, and tend to do it without even thinking about it. So of course, on my way back I began to sing a tune that particular night. It was unusually bright outside for being so late. The sky was still a dull blue and there was hardly a shadow, despite being well past 8:30, and I got into the quarter mark of the road, an almost gateway of bushes on a small ridge going further into the road, when I heard something yell. A yell that very distinctly sounded like an old man. Later, once I got home, I'd realized that there was a word in that yell too. Help. At the time I didn't think too much of it, which, yes, was especially dumb of me. I know I'd love to pull out every excuse under the sun, but I was evidently feeling very stupid that night. Now that I've had time to think about it too, I've noted two things. 1. There was no possible way that there could have been an elderly man on or near the road. My grandma is the only person that lives on that end of the road. 2, as I mentioned, was the word in the yell help. My boyfriend, after hearing the story, said it was meant to be a lure. But for what me death, all that fun stuff. As I walked I got to the halfway mark of the road. A field of dead yellow grass and a single fallen tree on the left-hand side of the road lay there. I'd seen it hundreds of times before and every time, I thought, why is that tree still there? As I took my courtesy look at the tree, that was when I noticed something or someone it to this day. I don't know what I saw. To be honest, it wasn't a crypt, not a monster nor a demon, but standing a good 30 feet away from the tree was, honest to God, and what I can only describe it as was a sheet ghost, a simple rounded pillar of white, nearly 8 foot tall, and as still as the tree before it stood there, and it saw me too. I know it did. It had no eyes, no face, but I could feel its gaze upon me. I had never truly known fear before that night, but I froze in place and felt like a mouse beneath a cat's paw, caught and hopeless faster than I could blink. It behind the tree and seemed to stay there. 30 feet traversed in under a second, and once I was behind the tree, it stayed there and I could move again. The sensible among you probably think that I ran, but I didn't. I didn't want to get its attention again. 10 minutes of absolute silence and paranoia as I walk home. I was utterly terrified. I got home and there sat my grandma on her little red couch, smoking a cigarette. "You look like you've seen a ghost." She chuckled. Well, to be honest, I think I had. I have gotten all kinds of answers over the years for what I saw Skinwalker when to go hide behind. For now I just want to share my story, and let speculation generate more ideas, as to maybe what I saw. So if you have any ideas, then please do share. I just recently remembered this story from when I was quite young, so I figured that I could share it here, as looking back, it's well kind of creepy. So I grew up in the Midwest, a little north of Chicago. When I was probably around 12, a friend and I saw some deer behind his house. There was a large field behind it that a forest bordered, so it wasn't uncommon for deer to be there. Being kids, we wanted to go and pet the deer, so we slowly approached them. We walked across the field to them so that we wouldn't spook them looking back. The deer really should have ran. Two big creatures walking towards a herd of deer really should have spooked them, but they all just kind of kept on eating the grass and standing there. I was in front of my friend, so I got a closer look at the deer than he did. I would guess that I was maybe about 6 feet away from this deer when it finally looked up at me. That was when I noticed her knees and saw that they were blooded. I just figured that it was because she had previously laid down on them or something and got scratched up. I looked up at her face and I was filled with fear, something that was very unlike me as a kid, and so we ran. Now remembering this later, something that I didn't think about at the time, as strange was the fact that her knees were actually facing the wrong way, not like they were broken, but like they had grown to be the wrong way. Of course she could have had a defect or something like that, but everything combined with the feeling of dread that I felt looking into her eyes, it creeps me out all these years later. If anyone has any thoughts on this, then please do share, because I don't know, it could be nothing, but it definitely was freaky. I'm from a small country in South America, and attended a religious school. Every year you go to this sort of spiritual getaway, in a camp that's situated in an open field next to a small river, and this sort of forested mountain area. Said place is beautiful, but gives off an off vibe. I guess almost like it's lost in time due to its very old structures. And because of this the place has been shrouded in mysteries and horror stories. It doesn't help to that the whole town was once burned to the ground in a very gruesome war that almost wiped out my country off the map in the 1800s. Anyway, here's what happened. So it was my last year in school, our last camp, and after a long day, all of my class was tired from hiking the forest next to the camp. After dinner and a short stay at the campfire, we were sent to bed that night. My class was made mostly of women. There were very few young men there, only about 6 including me. So we had the whole dorm hall for us, and that was pretty sweet. Now this dorm, which was housing only 16s, was a long hall full of bunks made for at least 40 people. Since we didn't have to share, we all chose top bunks next to each other, 3 on my side, including me, and 3 on the row facing me. It was about midnight and we were just sort of lying there, talking, joking and laughing in the dark, since the lights were out anyway. But after a couple of minutes I must have fallen asleep. Now I woke up at what I assume was between maybe 2:00 or 3 in the morning. I rose my head from the sheets to see my best friend in his bunk in front of me, also raising his head. He sort of nods jokingly to the bunk next to him where another classmate was sleeping. He sort of nods jokingly to the bunk next to him where another classmate was sleeping. When I turn, I see the silhouette of my classmate just sort of standing and staring at his bed. I laugh quietly and nod to my friend as to play a prank on him. But then, before we could act, I see the silhouette crouch and notice that my classmate was fully asleep in his bed. Almost at the same time, my friend and I react and look at each other wide-eyed. Both of us cover ourselves in our sheet, Pat doing our best to fall asleep again. Somehow we eventually managed to do so, but the next morning I went straight to my friend, and before I could finish asking if he saw it too, he just interrupted with a yes, and he told me exactly what he saw. It was the same thing. We approached this classmate and explained it to him. Of course he thought that we were joking, but both me and my friend remember that event to this day, talking about it every now and then, or almost 7 or 8 years after it happened. There was no way that it was one of us, because we were all accounted for in our bunks, and so we have no idea who was standing there that night. Also, it wouldn't have been such a big thing if I was the only one who saw it, but the fact that my friend saw the exact same thing that I did, well, it gave me huge chills. I hope one day that I get an explanation for what happened that, but somehow I just don't think I will. Almost 20 years ago now, I was traveling up and down Chile for a while with my friends, backpacking essentially, but we had some friends here and there, and one of our home bases was the parents of one in our group. His stepfather was a natural doctor, awesome right, except our contract attracted something severe at one point in the Atacama Desert, and over the course of 3 weeks while my friends continued on, I was slowly dying while this dude was giving me 30 drops of this and that or 46 of this. And that at one point as I was convulsing in their bathtub. The mother decided enough was enough, and I had to go to the hospital after this. I just remember the feeling of the winter's grass on my heels as I ran down a giant hill to where my friends were. I remember the feeling in my chest. I wanted so bad to reach them. I arrived and no one noticed at all. I observed them for what felt like more than a minute after running upon them, and no one even flinching. It was startling, but it made me stay perfectly still and just listen, and then, in the blink of an eye, a woman who I had never met before, but looked so weirdly like me, suddenly was to my left and she said, "Go back now." It wasn't a threat. It was like a mother tells a toddler. I don't know, but I immediately turned around and in a weird sort of urgent, but joyful sense, I ran back up this wet thick hill without seeing or speaking to her again, and I woke up in the hospital to a man almost laughing, telling me that he'd never seen someone so dry that was still alive. But the weirdest thing is that our lady confirmed the actual conversations my friends were having. That I observed that day, and I have no explanation for that whatsoever. I don't remember reaching the top of the hill or anything, just my hands grabbing at ferns and that I was wet, like as if I was running up a hill in my home, which is always wet. It's rainforest, and I was totally dehydrated completely for weeks. At that point, I remember climbing in the ground and my toes in my hand on ferns, and then the doctors just smiling at me with their faces. What I heard them talking about was just so mundane too. One of my friends was talking about agricultural class, where you meet the cows with holes in their stomachs. She was describing how they keep everything hygienic, a random conversation to have with a history and political science major, and honestly nothing that I would have had any prior knowledge about too. But she was basically describing the hole, and what goes on with it and all that. Like I said, I reiterated this to them and they confirmed that this was actually what they were talking about, and it was in the location that I saw in my. Well, whatever that state was, many things in my life have been very spooky, but a pinnacle event always stands out. I worked in a cemetery that was built on the grounds of a carriage house that burned down, taking at least one human and some horses with it. Now, there was also a pauper's grave of unknown remains transplanted from a tiny rural graveyard there too, and one Saturday, I was on duty and very aware of the male shadow figure who lured around the office. You could hear him walking with a cane up and down the hall. It always put me on edge. He felt ominous and disquieting. I had a burial that day and the family no-showed. Later on I swore that I heard someone in the lobby down the hall from my office though, but when I got there they were gone. I assumed it was the family and rushed out to find them. We played Ring Around the Rosies, with a huge funeral home between us. Finally I realized there were no cars in the lot besides mine, and I hadn't caught a glimpse of someone just rounding a corner since a lap ago, so perhaps they left. Later on, I was in the giant vault that doubled as our records room. When my back was turned, the door slammed shut. It can only be opened with a key from the inside, and guess what wasn't on me? You, as well as my cell phone. Panic took a while to set in, and no matter what I did, I just could not get that door to open. I could meanwhile distinctly hear a man chuckling outside though sitting against the door, calculating how many hours till Monday got here, and the likelihood of the ground skies coming into the lobby, and seeing the normally open vault door was closed. Before I could talk myself really off of the deep end, the door suddenly bolted open and I flopped back, knocking myself off the metal threshold. Hours later I woke up after apparently being knocked out. The sound of a dull shuffle stepped near my ear, oddly startling me, or maybe I got a sudden whiff of the familiar leathery cologne that lingered in the clouds around the building. Inexplicably, by the way, I was awakened. I wasted no time in looking up and leaving. So I live in Virginia, in an old plantation, and there's a cemetery right up the road from here. My sister. She is also super spiritual, and is in contact with psychics, and all that live near us. I don't believe in any of that, but one time she called her and told her don't go outside at night, because the deers aren't actually deers, we'd right anyway. We have seen some circles of bones. My sister and her friend have also been chased through the woods by something, and if you're outside at night, it kind of sounds like there's double the amount of footsteps sometimes that they're supposed to be. That could just be paranoia, I admit, but other people have recognized it too. I've also always been like I don't believe in the paranormal sort of stuff. There's always a reason for something. So it's not like I normally jump to paranormal conclusions, but I don't know. This one just seems different. So last night at like 3:00 a.m. I know it's kind of ironic. It's the devil hour and all that, but it really was 3. I was outside smoking at this little burnt-up shed in front of my house listening to music. I turned my music off, because I was about ready to go inside. I stand up to put my jacket on and like stretch and all that, and then something just screams, like absolutely belts out scream. I've listened to foxes and owls that do the same thing, but honestly it sounded nothing like those. Whatever it was, its scream sounded like something straight out of a horror movie. I was standing there scared, obviously, and the trees were rustling and it just kept screaming like it was being attacked or something. My first thought was that must be a bear or something. But then I realized that bears don't scream like that. So I'm standing there shaking. I can barely stand, in fact, and I decide that I needed to get a weapon quickly out of the shed before I tried to go back inside. The house wasn't very close, so I wait until the noise stops, and the second that I move my leg, I made no noise. Mind you, something screams and runs into the woods, just screaming. I could hear it getting farther and farther away, because it just kept on screaming. Then the dogs down the road started barking, so I finally got into the shed. I grab a plank of wood, it's all I had, and my phone and my jacket, and slowly start walking back to the house, watching over my shoulder. Nothing else happened that night as far as I could tell, but when my sister opened the door, I was in tears and I was shaking that night too. I just sat there for hours pondering what the heck I just heard. So if anybody knows what I should do in order to protect myself, or what it could have been, then please do let me know. Also, if you do think it's just an animal, which it's possible, I suppose, then let me know what you think it is. And I'll let you know if it sounded like it. Quite honestly, though, whatever it was, it sounded huge, and on top of that, I'm really not convinced that it actually was an animal. Many years ago my nephew and I went for a camping or fishing trip out to Cumber in Maryland. There's a state campground that is located on Ponak River. The sides are dispersed for the most part, and not many people were there camping. We drove to the end of the campground, to the last campsite, far away from the other campers as we could get. We set up camp and everything was normal. It was quiet that day too, with the exception of normal sounds in the forest. Then, at around 10 or maybe 11 at night, we heard the sound of a woman singing in the woods. Not a song that you could recognize. It was more of a melody without words. I guess I heard it. My nephew heard it and my dog heard it too. My dog was laying down by the fire and jumps up and starts staring into the woods. I look at my nephew and he looks freaked out. I asked him if he heard the woman singing and he says I don't hear anything and I'm going to bed, which is total BS, because he's about 10 feet away from me and it was pretty loud. It sounded as if it was coming from one direction though, but no direction in particular. I've read about disembodied voices and maybe that's what we heard. It sounded like someone maybe 20 or 30 feet away, though it wasn't scary or ominous, but it was a little bit unsettling. I told my nephew that we should walk around and see what it was, but he just wasn't interested, and after a few minutes it stopped. I can say for sure that nobody was hiding in those woods too. I've camped with my dogs for years, and he was very alert to things moving around in the woods. He would have made it known to someone that they weren't welcome there, and it was strange that he didn't bark or growl. He just sort of stood up and stared into the woods, just like I did. I tried to find any info online about similar experiences there, but I didn't come up with anything. It was a strange experience for sure, and it really has me scratching my head at the time that this all happened. I must have been about 9 years old. I was in bed one night and heard the radio in the kitchen going. My mom would almost always work the 11:00 p.m. to 7:00 a.m. shift, but on Tuesdays would take the mid-shift because we would have family night on Wednesdays. I assume it must have been a Tuesday when this happened, because my mom was in fact home. My mom worked a lot, and I mean 22 days out of the month most months, so it was not uncommon for us to try to help when she was up late cleaning anyway. As I walked down the stairs, I noticed that all the lights in the house downstairs were off and just the kitchen light was on. This already had me running for the kitchen because our walls were a deep green. As I mentioned before, my mom worked the late shift and my dad purposefully painted the living room area a dark color so that when the lights were out and the blackout curtains were closed, it would be dark enough for my mom to fall asleep after work. As I entered the kitchen, my mom was at the sink, and when I thought about it afterward, I only heard the radio going downstairs, not the sink, but she was washing dishes when I walked. In any case, her back was turned to me, so I couldn't see her face. I asked Mom, "Do you want some help cleaning?" But she didn't answer me. I asked a second time, and this time there was a bit of a moaning as an answer. This didn't immediately alarm me, because it didn't sound like a zombie or anything, moaning more like I don't know kind of moan. If that makes sense. I just replied with okay. Well, if you want me to help, just let me know. If you can't get enough of these bone-chilling stories, don't forget to subscribe for more.